Shalom and welcome back to another episode of Ezra International's It's All About the Aliyah. You know, for over 25 years now, Ezra International has been helping the poorest of the poor Jewish people make it home to the land of Israel, the land of their biblical destiny. Hi, I'm your host, Gary Christofero. And in today's program, we're going to be talking about patterns. You know, God reveals himself in patterns. He helps his people to recognize his hand, his presence, his faithfulness through certain patterns we see in the scripture and in our lives today. So once again, the Aliyah is at the heart of these patterns that I'm going to be speaking about because it really is all about the Aliyah. Let's get started. Aliyah and exile and Aliyah. Where does this pattern start? It starts with Abraham. As I mentioned to you once before, Abraham was the first man, first individual to make Aliyah. And we're going to look at the scriptures and we're going to look at the patterns of his journeys that match up so beautifully or foreshadow the things that would come in the lives of his descendants. So first of all, let's talk about when Abraham arrives in the land for the first time. Aliyah. Abraham is the first to make Aliyah. He goes to a place where God has shown him in the land of Canaan. And he arrives in a place we know today as Ilan Moreh. Ilan Moreh is near the ancient city of Shechem. And today it is called Nablus by the Arabs. Nearby is Mount Gerizim and Ebal, the hills of the blessings and the curses. If you stand on the mountaintops looking down on Ilan Moreh, I'm telling you, and I think I've shared this before, but it's as if the voice of God is still reverberating through those hills, through the wind that you see, that's always seemed to be whipping and blowing when you're standing on those mountaintops, because this is such a profound and historic moment, because here is the place that God told Abraham to come and then instructs him to go walk the width and the length of this land, because this will be the land of his descendants. Now, we have a short break in his stay in the land at this point. As the narrative goes, as the story is told, Abraham has to go to Egypt because of a famine. Here, once again, we see a foreshadowing of the descendants of Abraham in the land of Israel. Famine strikes, they go to Egypt, and they return. Abraham goes to Egypt and then returns. This is a foreshadowing of the days ahead, and we will read about that, how this happens in a moment. But first, I want to talk to you about what happens when Abraham comes back to the land. God cuts covenant with him in Genesis chapter 15. This is so important. Now, I've talked to you about the unconditional nature of the Abrahamic covenant. Let's just talk about the imagery here for a moment. In Genesis chapter 15, starting in verse 1, I'll set it up, but then we'll read verse 5. Abraham has been told by God that he's going to have descendants. Well, he says to God, the only descendant I have is my servant Eliezer from Damascus. And God says to Abram at this point, he says, no, it's going to be somebody from your own loins. And he takes him outside. And in verse 5, he says, then he brought him outside and said, look now toward heaven and count the stars if you are able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. And he believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to him for righteousness. The sages say that Abraham was so obedient that he actually went outside and began to count the stars because God had instructed him to do that. And God rewarded this obedience and this faithfulness of Abraham. Of course, it didn't end there. There was so much more as he went on. And God instructed him now to cut 3 animals. He tells him to take a heifer, a goat, and a ram. And of course, there were some birds involved, but the large animals he cut in half. Now, this process probably sounds very foreign to us in the 21st century. But Abraham knew exactly what this was all about. This was how individuals at that time cut covenant with one another by slicing these animals in two. And then the two parties would normally walk between the animals. And it was believed that if one of those parties broke covenant with the other, that what they see done to the animals should be done to them. That's how serious they took this covenant making process. And Abraham recognized it. We don't recognize it in our day potentially, other than the fact that we read it in Scripture. But it's probably quite foreign to our way of thinking. But he knew what God was doing. He was cutting covenant with them. The only difference was here, and we'll read it in a moment, is that God passes through the animals in the form of a flaming torch. Abraham does not. Why? Again, because it's an unconditional covenant. God is going to be the one who guarantees the parameters of this covenant. He is by his own reputation, by his own word, he is going to swear by himself. If you remember Hebrews chapter 6, verse 13 through 18, I believe it is, it says that because God could swear by no one greater, he swore on his own reputation and his own word. And by these two immutable things that God can't lie, and the oath itself, this particular covenant is still enforced today. So he makes covenant here now with Abraham. But before he does, I want you to notice that it says the vultures came down on the carcasses of these animals, and Abraham had to fight them away. I believe with all my heart that this is another pattern, another foreshadowing of all the demonic forces that were set loose on the Jewish people when this covenant was made. That this was Satan's immediate attempt to try to thwart the covenant and the covenant people. And from that point on, they have been under attack by all demonic forces throughout time and still are today. And therefore, it's one of the reasons why God expects us to be their allies in all of this. So we're going to read verses 12 through 18 here now. When the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. Then he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them for 400 years. And we're going to talk about why that is in just a moment. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge afterwards, and they shall come out with great possessions. Now for you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you shall be buried at a good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall return, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Here, there's the pattern. They will go to Egypt, and they will return. Why? To be a vessel of God's judgment on the Amorites. It is too early. Abraham is just a one man, and he's going to be a family. But the Amorites, these people who live in the land of Canaan, need to be judged, and God will use the Jewish people, the Israelites, at some point to be the vessel of that judgment. But it's not yet that time. So he says, it came to pass when the sun went down and it was dark that, behold, it appeared a smoking oven and a burning torch that passed between these pieces. And on that same day the Lord made covenant with Abram, saying, your descendants shall be given the land from the river of Egypt to the great river of Euphrates. And then he goes on and talks about all the ites that are in the land. Now, this is where we hear about the idea of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob going to a nation that is not theirs, and they would be persecuted. And in verse 46 of Genesis chapter 46, verse 1, we see God speaking to Jacob. Now you have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We'll talk about Isaac in a moment. Jacob now is being instructed to go ahead and do what God has called him to do. His name has now been changed to Israel, but you see in the narrative, God speaks of Israel and Jacob interchangeably, because I believe Israel is the mission. Jacob is the man. Jacob's name becomes Israel because God takes this man and gives him a purpose, a mission for the entire world. Verse 1 of chapter 46. So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to God of his father, Isaac. Then God spoke to Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here I am. So he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt. I will make you a great nation there. You see, there it is. The pattern was set up by Abraham to go to Egypt and come back, to make the trip and make Aliyah in return. And we see there this pattern of God sending his people to Egypt, and so they could come out of Egypt and continue this pattern of exile and Aliyah. Okay, so we know with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm, God brings Israel out of the land of Egypt. Now that pattern continues today. And I'm going to go to a familiar passage. I've read it before if you're a regular follower of this program. It is Jeremiah 16, verse 14 through 15. And Jeremiah was told by God to say these words, therefore, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that it shall no more be said, the Lord lives who brought up the children of Israel from the land of Egypt. But the Lord lives who brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north and from the lands where he has driven them. For I will bring them back into their land, which I gave to their fathers. There is that pattern of the exodus, the exile, and the return. We're living in the day where God, his reputation has gone from the God who brought them out of the land of Egypt to the God who's bringing them out of the lands of the north and all of the nations that he scattered them. And I submit to you that that is the greater miracle, that he is, after 2,000 years of exile, bringing them back one by one, family by family, out of all the nations. So with that, we've set up the pattern of exile, of Aliyah, exile, and Aliyah. I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk to you about another pattern that we see in this plan of redemption. Because after all, the entire plan that God gave to Abraham was not just about Israel. It was about the world. So we'll be right back.
See, I will bring them from the land of the north and gather them from the ends of the earth. Among them will be the blind and the lame, expectant mothers, and women in labor. A great throng will return. Jeremiah 31:8.
Ezra International has helped thousands, like Olim the blind from Ukraine and Giergu from Hungary. Little Vadim, who is going blind, is now getting the help he needs in Israel, thanks to Ezra International. Jewish families around the world hear the call to return to their homeland. Their prophets foretold long ago that the return to Israel in our time would be a miracle, and it is greater even than the exodus from Egypt under Moses. The prophets also foretold another calling for our time, to the Gentiles, to those of us from among the nations. It is a call that Ezra International responds to each and every day by providing humanitarian aid to impoverished Jewish families. You can answer that call too. A gift of only $30 per month for a year can help Ezra International and return a poor Jewish person, restoring them to the land of their promise. Call the number below or visit EzraInternational.org and give your gift of hope today.
All right, before the break, we were talking about the patterns of Aliyah and exile and Aliyah again. We were talking about the Exodus story. Now I want to share with you another Aliyah story that I believe God showed me, an extremely important pattern that ties into the redemption story. All right, we're gonna talk about an Aliyah that Abram made with Isaac, the trip that he makes to Mount Moriah. You remember, Aliyah means to ascend, and he goes up into the mountain of Moriah. We're going to go back to Genesis chapter 22, and we're going to talk about the call of God to Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. This is an incredibly dramatic story, and it's packed with imagery and patterns and foreshadowing of things to come. I'll start with verses 1 through 5 and pause of Genesis chapter 22. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. Then he said, Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I will tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted his eyes, and he saw the place far off. And Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey and the lad, and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. I'm going to stop there for a moment. Have you ever noticed that Abraham says, we will come back to you? He knows that God has instructed him to go and sacrifice his son, yet he says, we will come back to you. His faith is such that I believe he feels if he has to go through with this sacrifice of his son, God has the power to raise his son from the dead, and he would bring him back to these men. Now, we don't know what God showed Abraham in this vision when he put him to sleep during the covenant. I have my thoughts, and maybe it is why his faith was so absolute at this point, that he could be unconditionally obedient to God because he knew something that only God had shown him. We can only speculate, but let's continue with this story. But before we read it, I want to set up for those of you who have never been to Jerusalem. I'll have to be very specific about the topography that I'm about to talk about. If those of you who have been to the land, you'll recognize the terrain and the topography that I'm going to talk about. But I'm going to be very careful, not assuming that everyone in my audience has been there. Abraham comes to the valley before the mountains of Jerusalem. Now, again, if you've never been there, I'll try to demonstrate with using my fingers. There are 3 valleys that Jerusalem is built upon. In the south, they converge. These 3 valleys are the Kidron Valley, the Valley of Gehenna, and the Tyropoeon Valley. The Tyropoeon in the middle, the Kidron Valley on the east, and the Valley of Gehenna on the west. This is the view that Abraham would have looking up at the city. Now, it was called Shalem at the time because it is believed that Shem was Melchizedek, and this was the place that Abraham was met by Melchizedek. But Shalem was the name of this city, not Jerusalem yet. But we have this city built on 3 valleys because the letter Shin, it forms the letter Shin in Hebrew, is used in the name of God, El Shaddai, the God all-powerful and all-merciful, the God who protects is what it means. And so isn't it just like God to build his city on these 3 valleys on a formation of a letter within his name, the Shin. I hope that is clear to you. It's difficult to describe. It's more easily demonstrated if you can see it and if you can see the Hebrew letters. But anyway, God takes Abraham to this place, and he lifts his eyes, which means he's in the valley below and sees the mountain ahead of him. Now, it talks about God putting or Abraham putting the wood on the back of Isaac here. I want to paint this picture for you. So Abraham, verse 6, so Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the 2 of them went together. Now think about that. What a picture. Can you think of somebody else who carried wood on his back and went to Jerusalem, went through Jerusalem in a similar manner? The picture is very clear to me. We have Isaac, the only son of Abraham. We have a picture of an only son of the father going to sacrifice him here. Think about this clearly. Now, this is what I want to share with you that is unique to my experience, and you should not have heard this from anybody else. But as I was standing one time looking over this, the city of Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, you know, you have the omnipresence of God all the time, but you have a manifest presence of God at particular times. And this was one of those times. I felt as I was standing on the Mount of Olives, the tour group that I had brought over there was being instructed by our tour guide, and I was taking a moment just looking at the Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, and I felt that God was saying, observe, note the land. And the land is like this. You have the valley where the three valleys converge to the south. You have the city of David. You have a tabletop now where Herod had built the Temple Mount, the retaining walls around the Temple Mount and the temple. And then on the northern side of this city, you see the tree line of the garden tomb. I could see these things from there. Now keep in mind, this tabletop was cut by Herod. The hill would have looked like this at the time of Abraham. He would have come up and continued ascending to the point of the peak of the hill. Okay? So at the time that God points this out to me, I am not exactly sure what he's trying to get at, but it happened again, a second time. God shows up when we were doing what we do all the time, walking through the rabbi's tunnel that runs along the retaining wall of the Temple Mount. And when you start that journey, the pavement is far below you because this city's been built upon, destroyed and built upon. So the pavement, the ground is below you and the walls beside you and continues above your head. As you walk to the north along the city, so you're walking to the north, you begin to meet up with not only the ground meets your feet like this, you're walking in the tunnel, the ground meets your feet, and you meet up with the bedrock of Mount Moriah. So as you're walking along this wall, you meet up with the bedrock of Mount Moriah, and once again, God said, observe. And then a final time, as I'm driving by the northern part of the city, if we go back to my arm map, we're driving along the northern part of the city near the garden tomb. And as I look to my left, you can see where the city walls have been built on the bedrock of Mount Moriah. And it has been quarried out even on the northern side. But the bedrock is used now to continue, is continued, and the walls continue. So the walls are much larger on the east side, on the west side, and on the southern side. But on the west side and on the north side, they begin to be built on the bedrock of Mount Moriah. Why am I telling you all this? Because the location of Isaac's sacrifice, I believe, is right here on the northern side of the city. I'm going to finish this story here, and then I'll tell you why that is so significant, if you haven't already figured it out. All right, so let's pick this up in, we'll pick it up in verse 11. But the angel, so Abraham's about to strike Isaac. And remember, Isaac is 37 years old. I don't know if you realize that, but Isaac is not the little boy that we pictured in our Sunday school lessons. Isaac is a fully grown man, according to the chronological mapping of this. He's 37 years old, so he could have resisted if he wanted to, his old man of a father, but he didn't. A son willingly submissive to his father at this point. And so the angel of the Lord stops Abraham at this point on verse 11. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of this place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it will be provided. And the angel of the Lord called Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Blessings I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars in heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your descendants shall possess the gates of their enemies. There it is. Abraham set the parameters of this covenant with God. God made it an unconditional covenant. Abraham said, I will go this far, to the point of sacrificing my own son. And God said, I will do the same. And I believe this picture of Abraham taking Isaac to this place is a perfect picture of when Jesus, coming out of the northern side of the city, is taken to a place called Golgotha on the northern side of this city. Now, I know archaeologists will argue that it's the Holy Sepulchre is the place. There are some who argue that it is the Mount of Olives that is the place. But I am convinced, and I'm sharing with you my experience, I am convinced that the very exact spot that Abraham took Isaac to sacrifice him is the same spot that God had his own son placed on the Roman execution stake on our behalf. He paid the penalty for you and I. A redemption was sealed by him paying the price in the very same spot. They both went up to Jerusalem. They both made Aliyah to fulfill their mission. Yeshua fulfilled his mission by going to his death, submitting his will to the will of the Father for you and I. It's a beautiful picture. It's a beautiful pattern. It's a beautiful foreshadowing for us. So I hope you have enjoyed that. I hope it makes sense to you. If you could follow the arm map, you got the picture. So God bless you. Thank you for joining me today. I hope to see you again in another episode soon. God bless you. Shalom.